The racist cop punched an old black woman in the park. But when she pulled out her FBI badge, in the heart of Millbrook, a mid-sized city grappling with its history of racial tension, lived Evelyn Carter. At 62, Evelyn's petite frame and silver-streaked hair belied a lifetime of strength and resilience. Her deep brown eyes, sharp and observant, had seen more than most could imagine. To her neighbors, she was simply Miss Evelyn, the kindly retired schoolteacher who tended to her roses and always had a warm smile for passersby. What the residents of Maple Street didn't know was that Evelyn Carter was far more than a retired educator. For the past 3 decades, she had been a dedicated agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in civil rights investigations and community relations. Even in her so-called retirement, Evelyn continued to work on special assignments. Her years of experience and unassuming appearance making her an invaluable asset in delicate undercover operations. Officer Derek Bronson patrolled the streets of Millbrook with a chip on his shoulder and a quick temper. At 38, he was a poster child for the old guard of policing, brash, authoritarian, and deeply set in his ways. His impressive physique and neatly pressed uniform commanded respect, or at least compliance, from most of Millbrook's residents. But beneath the surface simmered a toxic mix of prejudice and resentment, fueled by years of unchecked biases and a stubborn refusal to adapt to changing times. Millbrook itself was a city in transition. Once a bastion of segregation, it had slowly begun to diversify, with new families and businesses bringing fresh energy to its tree-lined streets. But the ghosts of its past lingered, manifesting in subtle and not-so-subtle ways in its institutions, particularly within the police force. As summer settled over the city, bringing with it long, warm evenings and the scent of blooming magnolias, tensions were simmering just below the surface. The recent appointment of the city's first black police chief had been met with resistance from some quarters, including officers like Bronson, who saw it as a threat to the status quo. Unbeknownst to the residents of Millbrook, the FBI had been quietly monitoring the situation, concerned about reports of escalating racial incidents and allegations of police misconduct. It was in this context that Evelyn Carter found herself assigned to a new undercover operation, tasked with gathering intelligence on potential civil rights violations within the Millbrook Police Department. As Evelyn settled into her role as the unassuming Miss Carter, and Officer Bronson continued his patrols with growing resentment, neither could have predicted the explosive confrontation that was about to unfold. A moment that would shake Millbrook to its core and force a reckoning long overdue. The day that would change everything in Millbrook dawned bright and clear. A perfect summer morning that gave no hint of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Evelyn Carter, in her guise as the retired schoolteacher, set out for her daily walk in Centennial Park, her keen eyes observing the ebb and flow of city life around her. As she made her way along the winding paths of the park, Evelyn noticed a group of young black teenagers gathered near the basketball courts. They were laughing and talking animatedly, their voices carrying on the warm breeze. She smiled to herself, remembering her own youth and the simple joy of spending time with friends. However, the peaceful scene was soon interrupted by the arrival of Officer Derek Bronson in his patrol car. Evelyn watched as he pulled up to the curb, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the group of teens. She could see the tension in his posture, the way his hand instinctively moved to rest on his holster. Bronson exited his vehicle, approaching the teens with an aggressive stance. "All right, break it up," he barked, his voice harsh and authoritative. "What are you all doing here? Planning some trouble?" The teenagers, startled by the officer's sudden appearance and hostile tone, fell silent. One of them, a tall boy with a kind face, spoke up hesitantly. "We're not doing anything wrong, officer. We're just hanging out." Bronson's face darkened. "Don't talk back to me, boy. I know your type. Always up to no good. Let's see some ID, all of you." Evelyn, her FBI instincts kicking in, knew she had to intervene. She couldn't stand by and watch this clear abuse of power and racial profiling. Taking a deep breath, she approached the group, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, officer," she said, drawing Bronson's attention. "These young people aren't causing any trouble. They're just enjoying the park, same as anyone else." Bronson whirled around, his eyes flashing with anger at the interruption. "Stay out of this, old woman. This is police business." But Evelyn stood her ground, years of training and experience evident in her steady gaze. "I've been watching them, and they've done nothing wrong. You have no reason to demand their identification or harass them." The teenagers watched this exchange with a mixture of fear and awe, surprised to see someone standing up to the intimidating officer on their behalf. Bronson, his face flushing with rage, took a step towards Evelyn. "I said stay out of this. Do you want to be arrested for interfering with police business?" Evelyn's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath her words. "Officer, I'm simply pointing out that you're violating these young people's rights. They've committed no crime, and you have no probable cause for this stop." Something in Evelyn's demeanor, the authority in her voice despite her appearance as a harmless old woman, seemed to push Bronson over the edge. In a move that would shock everyone present and have far-reaching consequences, he suddenly lashed out, his fist connecting with Evelyn's face. The sound of the impact seemed to echo through the park. Evelyn stumbled back, more surprised than hurt, as gasps and cries of shock erupted from the onlookers. The teenagers, horrified, began pulling out their phones to record the incident. Bronson, realizing what he had done, but too far gone in his anger to back down, reached for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for assaulting an officer and interfering with police business," he growled, roughly grabbing Evelyn's arm. But Evelyn, despite the growing bruise on her cheek, remained remarkably composed. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Officer Bronson," she said, her voice low but clear. Bronson paused, confusion mixing with the anger on his face. "What are you talking about, old woman?" With deliberate slowness, Evelyn reached into her pocket and pulled out a badge. "FBI," she said, holding it up for Bronson and the gathered crowd to see. "And you, officer, are in a world of trouble." The park fell silent, the only sound the chirping of birds and the distant hum of traffic. Bronson's face drained of color as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. The teenagers, still recording, looked on in amazement as the situation took this unexpected turn. In that moment, as Evelyn stood tall despite the assault she had just endured, and Officer Bronson realized the magnitude of his mistake, the course of Millbrook's future was irrevocably altered. The inciting incident had occurred, setting in motion a chain of events that would challenge the city's police force, its leadership, and its very identity in ways no one could have predicted. In the tense moments following Evelyn's revelation, the park erupted into a flurry of activity. Bystanders who had witnessed the assault began to gather, their phones out, recording every detail of the unfolding drama. Officer Bronson, his face a mask of shock and growing panic, took a stumbling step back from Evelyn. "FBI? What? What are you talking about?" he stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating in the face of this unexpected turn of events. Evelyn, maintaining her composure despite the throbbing pain in her cheek, calmly explained, "I'm Special Agent Evelyn Carter, here as part of an ongoing investigation into civil rights violations within the Millbrook Police Department." As she spoke, two men in suits emerged from a nearby van, quickly identifying themselves as FBI agents. They had been monitoring the situation from afar, ready to intervene if necessary. Now, they moved swiftly to secure the scene and begin gathering statements from witnesses. The revelation sent shockwaves through the gathered crowd. Whispers and exclamations rippled through the onlookers as the full implications of what they had just witnessed began to sink in. The teenagers who had been the initial targets of Bronson's aggression looked on in awe, suddenly seeing Evelyn in a completely new light. For Officer Bronson, the revelation was devastating. As the reality of his actions settled in, he realized that he had not only assaulted an elderly woman, but had done so to a federal agent in the course of her duties. The color drained from his face as he contemplated the severe consequences he would face. But the revelations didn't stop there. As Evelyn and her fellow agents began to process the scene, more truths came to light. Witnesses came forward, emboldened by Evelyn's presence, to share their own experiences of racial profiling and police harassment in Millbrook. It became clear that Bronson's actions were not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of misconduct within the department. One of Evelyn's fellow agents, reviewing the footage captured by the teenagers, made another startling discovery. In the background of one of the videos, they spotted another officer who appeared to be planting evidence near a group of black youths in another part of the park. This revelation suggested a level of coordinated misconduct that went beyond individual prejudices. As news of the incident spread rapidly through social media and local news outlets, more Millbrook residents began to come forward with their own stories. The FBI's presence, initially a closely guarded secret, was now public knowledge, and it seemed to open the floodgates of suppressed grievances and long-held fears. For Evelyn, each new piece of information confirmed what she had suspected, but hoped wasn't true: that the problems within the Millbrook Police Department ran deep and would require more than just the removal of a few bad apples to address. The most profound revelation, however, came from an unexpected source. As Bronson was being led away in handcuffs, he locked eyes with Evelyn. In that moment, she saw something that shocked her. Not defiance or anger, but a flicker of relief, as if a great burden had been lifted. It was a look she had seen before in long-term undercover operations, the look of someone who had been living a lie and was, on some level, grateful to finally be exposed. This silent exchange led Evelyn to a startling realization. The culture of racism and misconduct within the Millbrook PD wasn't just harming its victims in the community, it was also corrupting the officers themselves, trapping them in a cycle of fear, prejudice, and abuse of power. As the sun began to set on what had become a pivotal day in Millbrook's history, Evelyn knew that the revelations unearthed in those few chaotic hours in the park were just the beginning. The true depth of the problem and the challenge of addressing it was only starting to come to light. In the days following the incident in the park, Evelyn Carter found herself at a crossroads. The assault by Officer Bronson had unexpectedly blown her cover and thrust her into the public eye. As she sat in her temporary apartment, ice pack pressed to her still bruised cheek, she contemplated her next move. The easy path would be to step back, to hand over the investigation to her younger colleagues, and return to her quiet retirement. After all, she had already given decades of service to the Bureau and to the cause of civil rights. No one would blame her for choosing to bow out now, especially after being physically assaulted. But as Evelyn reviewed the evidence they had gathered, the testimonies from community members, the video footage, the patterns of misconduct that were emerging, she knew she couldn't walk away. This case had become personal, not just because of Bronson's attack, but because she saw in Millbrook a microcosm of the larger struggles for equality and justice that had defined her career and her life. After a long night of reflection, Evelyn made her decision. She would not only continue with the investigation, but would step into a more public role, using her unique position as both a respected FBI agent and a victim of police brutality to push for comprehensive reform in Millbrook. The consequences of her decision were immediate and far-reaching. When Evelyn announced her intentions at a press conference, it sent shockwaves through the city. Many praised her courage and commitment, seeing her as a champion for change. Others, particularly those with vested interests in maintaining the status quo, saw her as a threat. Within the Millbrook Police Department, reactions were mixed. Some officers, particularly younger ones, and officers of color, saw Evelyn as an ally in their own struggles against the department's entrenched culture. Others viewed her with suspicion and hostility, seeing her actions as a betrayal of law enforcement. Evelyn's decision also had personal consequences. Her face, bruised but determined, was splashed across local and national news outlets. She began receiving death threats, necessitating round-the-clock protection. The stress took a toll on her health, exacerbating the arthritis in her hands and leading to sleepless nights. Despite these challenges, Evelyn threw herself into the work. She began by establishing a community task force, bringing together local leaders, activists, and reform-minded police officers to develop a comprehensive plan for overhauling the Millbrook PD. Her years of experience in civil rights investigations proved invaluable as she guided the group through the complex process of police reform. One of the most significant consequences of Evelyn's decision was the ripple effect it had beyond Millbrook. Her story, that of an elderly black woman, a retired FBI agent, standing up to police brutality, captured the national imagination. Soon, she was being invited to speak at conferences, to testify before state legislatures, and to consult with police departments across the country. This increased visibility brought both opportunities and challenges. Evelyn found herself in a position to influence policy at a level she had never anticipated, but it also made her a target for those who opposed reform. Conservative media outlets began running hit pieces on her, digging into her past cases and attempting to discredit her work. Within Millbrook, the consequences of Evelyn's decision played out in complex ways. As the investigation progressed and more instances of misconduct came to light, the city found itself divided. There were protests calling for the immediate dismissal of implicated officers, countered by rallies in support of the police department. The city council meetings became battlegrounds, with heated debates about funding, oversight, and the very nature of policing in Millbrook. Evelyn's decision also had unexpected personal consequences. As she worked closely with members of the community and reform-minded officers, she found herself forming deep bonds. She became a mentor to young activists, a confidant to officers struggling with the changing culture, and a bridge between groups that had long been at odds. Perhaps the most profound consequence of Evelyn's decision came in the form of a late-night visit from Officer Bronson's wife. Tearful and conflicted, she revealed years of abuse she had suffered, painting a picture of a man whose professional misconduct was mirrored in his personal life. This revelation added a new layer of complexity to Evelyn's understanding of the case and reinforced her commitment to addressing the root causes of violence and abuse of power. As months passed and the investigation deepened, Evelyn often reflected on the consequences of her decision. The work was harder than anything she had done before. The stakes higher, the opposition more fierce. There were days when the weight of it all seemed almost too much to bear. But then she would receive a letter from a young person inspired by her stand, or see a small but meaningful change in police-community relations, or witness a moment of genuine understanding between former adversaries. In these moments, Evelyn knew that despite the high personal cost, her decision had been the right one. The consequences of Evelyn Carter's choice to stand and fight rippled out far beyond her, far beyond Millbrook. She had set in motion a chain of events that would challenge not just one police department, but the very nature of policing in America. As she steeled herself for the battles yet to come, Evelyn knew that the full consequences of her decision were still unfolding and would continue to shape the fight for justice long after her part in it was done. While Evelyn Carter's investigation and reform efforts took center stage, a secondary plot was unfolding within the Millbrook Police Department, centered around Officer Sarah Chen, a young Asian-American officer who had joined the force with idealistic notions of serving her community. Sarah had always felt like an outsider in the department, caught between her desire to be a good cop and her growing unease with the racist attitudes she witnessed among her colleagues. The incident with Evelyn and Officer Bronson had shaken her deeply, forcing her to confront the realities of systemic racism within the force she had sworn to serve. As the investigation progressed, Sarah found herself in an increasingly difficult position. She had witnessed numerous instances of misconduct, but had always stayed silent, fearing retaliation. Now, with the FBI presence in Millbrook, she faced a moral dilemma. Should she come forward with what she knew, potentially jeopardizing her career and relationships, or continue to stay silent? Sarah's internal struggle intensified when she overheard a group of senior officers discussing ways to obstruct the investigation. They were planning to intimidate witnesses, destroy evidence, and discredit Evelyn Carter. The realization that the corruption went far beyond individual bad actors like Bronson left Sarah feeling sick to her stomach. Unable to bear the weight of her knowledge alone, Sarah reached out to her former partner, Michael Rodriguez, who had left the force a year earlier under mysterious circumstances. To her surprise, Michael revealed that he had been forced out after attempting to report racist behavior within the department. Together, Sarah and Michael began to quietly gather evidence, documenting instances of misconduct and identifying other officers who might be willing to speak out. Their clandestine efforts added a layer of tension and intrigue to the ongoing investigation. As Sarah delved deeper into the department's dark underbelly, she discovered connections between certain officers and local criminal elements. It became clear that the racism and brutality were not just about prejudice, but were part of a larger system of corruption that allowed some officers to profit from the communities they were supposed to protect. This secondary plot intersected with the main story when Sarah, having finally gathered enough evidence to make a case, decided to approach Evelyn Carter. Her testimony and evidence would prove crucial in exposing the full extent of the problems within the Millbrook PD. Sarah's journey from a silent bystander to an active agent of change mirrored the larger transformation happening in Millbrook. It highlighted the difficult choices faced by those within the system when confronted with systemic injustice, and the power of individual courage in the face of institutional corruption. As this secondary plot developed, it added depth and complexity to the main narrative, showing that the path to reform would require not just external pressure, but also the bravery of those within the system willing to stand up for what was right. As the investigation into the Millbrook Police Department intensified, the relationships between key characters underwent significant transformations, shaped by the crucible of conflict and shared purpose. The relationship between Evelyn Carter and Sarah Chen evolved from one of cautious respect to a deep, mentoring friendship. Initially, Sarah had been in awe of Evelyn's courage and integrity, but hesitant to fully trust anyone associated with the investigation. However, as they began working together, sharing information and strategies, a bond formed between them. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of interviews and evidence review, Sarah confided in Evelyn. "I've always wanted to be a good cop," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I never realized how hard it would be to stand up against a whole system." Evelyn, recognizing the weight of Sarah's words, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's never easy to be the one who speaks out," she replied, "but it's the only way things ever change. You're braver than you know, Sarah." This moment marked a turning point in their relationship. Evelyn became not just a colleague, but a mentor and friend to Sarah, guiding her through the challenges of being a whistleblower and helping her navigate the complex world of police reform. The relationship between Evelyn and Officer Bronson, while adversarial, also underwent a surprising evolution. As the investigation progressed, Evelyn insisted on interviewing Bronson herself, despite concerns for her safety. During these sessions, she began to see beyond the angry racist facade to the insecurities and fears that drove his behavior. In one particularly intense interview, Bronson broke down. "I never wanted to be this person," he confessed, tears streaming down his face. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Evelyn, drawing on years of experience in interrogation and human psychology, saw an opportunity for redemption. "It's not too late to change," she told him, "but it starts with taking responsibility for your actions and being willing to do the hard work of transformation." This exchange marked the beginning of a complex relationship between Evelyn and Bronson. While she never excused his actions, Evelyn became an unlikely source of support for Bronson as he began the difficult journey of confronting his own biases and destructive behaviors. The relationship between Sarah Chen and her former partner, Michael Rodriguez, also deepened as they worked together to gather evidence. Their shared mission rekindled old feelings and brought new understanding between them. They found strength in each other, supporting one another through the stress and danger of their covert activities. "I never thought I'd be back in this world," Michael admitted one night as they pored over documents. "But doing this with you, it feels right, like we're finally living up to the oath we took." Sarah nodded, understanding the mix of fear and purpose in his voice. "We're not just partners anymore," she replied. "We're something more. We're the change we want to see in the department." Perhaps the most significant relationship development was between Evelyn and the community she was working to protect. As her role in the investigation became public, she found herself embraced by many of Millbrook's residents, particularly those in the Black community who had long suffered under discriminatory policing. Evelyn began attending community meetings, not just as an FBI agent, But as a concerned citizen, she listened to stories of pain and frustration, of hopes for a better future. In these gatherings, she formed connections that went beyond her official role, becoming a trusted figure and a symbol of the possibility of change. During one emotionally charged meeting, an elderly man stood up, his voice shaking with emotion. "Miss Evelyn," he said, "seeing you stand up to that officer, it gave us hope. For the first time in my life, I believe things might actually change around here." These words, and many others like them, reinforced Evelyn's commitment to seeing the investigation through, no matter the personal cost. The relationships she was forming with the people of Millbrook became a source of strength and motivation, driving her forward even on the darkest days. As these relationships evolved and deepened, they created a web of support and accountability that became crucial to the success of the reform efforts. They highlighted the power of human connection in the face of systemic injustice, showing how individual relationships could become the foundation for broader social change. The bonds forged in this time of crisis, between mentor and protege, between former adversaries, between partners reunited, and between an agent and her community, would prove to be critical in the challenges to come. They set the stage for the climactic events that would determine the future of policing in Millbrook, and potentially serve as a model for reform across the nation. The climax of Millbrook's struggle for police reform came to a head on a sweltering summer day, 6 months after Evelyn Carter's fateful encounter with Officer Bronson in the park. The City Council was set to vote on a comprehensive police reform bill, the product of months of investigation, community activism, and tense negotiations. The steps of City Hall were crowded with protesters, supporters, and media from across the country. Evelyn stood at the forefront, flanked by Sarah Chen and Michael Rodriguez, surrounded by a diverse coalition of community leaders and reform-minded police officers. As the council members filed into the building, a hush fell over the crowd. Everyone knew that this vote would determine the future of policing in Millbrook and potentially set a precedent for cities across the nation. Inside the council chambers, the atmosphere was tense. Evelyn, invited to speak before the vote, approached the podium. She looked out at the faces of the council members, some supportive, others hostile, and took a deep breath. "6 months ago," she began, her voice steady, "I stood in Centennial Park and witnessed firsthand the consequences of unchecked power and systemic racism within our police force. But that moment was just the tip of the iceberg, a symptom of a deeper, more pervasive problem that has plagued this community for generations." As Evelyn spoke, laying out the evidence her investigation had uncovered and painting a vision of a reformed police force that truly served and protected all citizens, the chamber was silent, hanging on her every word. Suddenly, a commotion erupted at the back of the room. A group of officers, led by those implicated in the investigation, burst in. Their faces were contorted with rage as they shouted accusations of betrayal and threats of retaliation. Before anyone could react, one of the officers rushed towards Evelyn, his hand reaching for his weapon. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. Sarah Chen, drawing on her training and newfound courage, moved to intercept the assailant. Meanwhile, Michael Rodriguez positioned himself to protect the council members. The chamber erupted into chaos. Security officers rushed to subdue the intruders, while others moved to protect the council members and civilians. Amidst the confusion, Evelyn remained at the podium, her voice rising above the din as she continued to speak, refusing to be silenced. "This is exactly why we need change," she called out, her words cutting through the chaos. This display of aggression and disregard for the democratic process only underscores the urgency of our cause. As order was gradually restored, the impact of what had just occurred settled over the room. The line between those resisting change and those fighting for it had never been more starkly drawn. Mayor Thompson, who had been wavering in her support for the reform bill, stood up. Her voice shook slightly as she addressed the chamber. "What we have just witnessed," she said, "is the clearest evidence of why this reform is not just necessary, but urgent. We cannot wait any longer to address the culture of violence and impunity that has infected our police force." With those words, she called for an immediate vote on the bill. The council members, many still shaken by what they had witnessed, began to cast their votes. One by one, the tally grew. As the final vote was cast, a roar went up from the crowd outside, who were watching the proceedings on large screens. The reform bill had passed with a wider margin than anyone had dared to hope. Evelyn, now surrounded by Sarah, Michael, and other supporters, felt a wave of emotion wash over her. They had done it. The climactic confrontation had laid bare the issues she had fought so hard to expose, and Millbrook had chosen the path of progress and accountability. But even as celebration erupted around her, Evelyn knew that this was not the end, but rather the beginning of a new chapter in their ongoing struggle for justice and equality in Millbrook. In the wake of the dramatic city council vote, Millbrook found itself at the beginning of a challenging journey towards implementing the sweeping police reforms that had been passed. The conflict that had begun with Evelyn's assault in the park had exploded into a citywide reckoning with issues of race, policing, and community trust. Now the hard work of resolving these deep-seated conflicts began in earnest. Mayor Thompson, recognizing the historic nature of the moment, established a police reform implementation task force. She appointed Evelyn Carter as its chair, a move that was met with both praise and controversy. Some saw it as a bold step towards real change, while others criticized it as putting an outsider in charge of internal affairs. Evelyn, acutely aware of the challenges ahead, assembled a diverse team that included community leaders, civil rights attorneys, reform-minded police officers, and representatives from the FBI's Community Relations Service. Their first task was to translate the broad strokes of the reform bill into concrete, actionable policies. One of the most contentious issues was the establishment of a civilian oversight board with real power to investigate police misconduct and recommend disciplinary action. The police union fought this tooth and nail, arguing that it would undermine officer morale and effectiveness. During a particularly heated meeting, a veteran officer stood up and confronted Evelyn. "You're hanging us out to dry," he accused. "How are we supposed to do our jobs with civilians second-guessing our every move?" Evelyn, remaining calm, responded, "Our job is to serve and protect all citizens. If we're doing that properly, we should welcome oversight, not fear it. This board isn't about punishment, it's about building trust and ensuring accountability." This exchange, witnessed by the entire task force, became a turning point. It sparked a frank and often uncomfortable dialogue about the realities of policing in a diverse community. Slowly, even the most resistant officers began to engage with the idea that accountability could actually make their jobs easier by rebuilding community trust. Another major focus of the conflict resolution effort was addressing the racial biases that had long plagued the department. Evelyn brought in experts to conduct intensive bias training for all officers. These sessions were often tense and emotional, as officers were forced to confront their own prejudices and the impact these had on their interactions with the community. During one such session, an officer broke down in tears, overwhelmed by the realization of how his unconscious biases had influenced his behavior on the job. "I never thought of myself as racist," he admitted to the group. "But looking back, I can see how many times I treated people differently because of the color of their skin. I don't want to be that person anymore." This vulnerable moment became a catalyst for deeper engagement with the training program, as more officers began to open up about their experiences and biases. Outside the department, Evelyn and her team worked tirelessly to rebuild trust with the community. They organized a series of town hall meetings, community policing initiatives, and youth outreach programs. These efforts were met with initial skepticism from many residents who had long mistrusted the police. At one community meeting, in a predominantly black neighborhood, an elderly man stood up and addressed Evelyn directly. "We've heard promises before," he said, his voice heavy with years of disappointment. "How do we know this time is different?" Evelyn acknowledged his concerns, sharing her own experiences both as a black woman and as a federal agent. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she admitted. "But this time, we have concrete policies, oversight mechanisms, and most importantly, a commitment from both the community and the department to see this through. We're asking for your partnership in this process. Hold us accountable, but also work with us to create the kind of policing this community deserves. Slowly, these efforts began to bear fruit. Community members started to engage more positively with officers, reporting crimes more frequently, and even volunteering to assist with neighborhood watch programs. The us versus them mentality that had long characterized police-community relations in Millbrook began to erode. However, the path to resolution was not without its setbacks. A few months into the reform process, an officer-involved shooting of a Latino teenager threatened to undo much of the progress that had been made. The incident sparked protests and renewed calls for police accountability. Evelyn and the task force worked quickly to address the situation with transparency and fairness. The officer involved was immediately placed on leave, and an independent investigation was launched. Unlike in the past, the department communicated openly with the public throughout the process, holding press conferences and community meetings to address concerns and share information as it became available. This approach, while not pleasing everyone, helped to prevent the kind of explosive unrest that had followed similar incidents in the past. It demonstrated the department's commitment to accountability and showed that the reforms were having a real impact on how the police operated in critical situations. As the first year of reforms drew to a close, Millbrook underwent an external audit to assess the progress of the changes. The results were mixed but encouraging. Use of force incidents had decreased significantly, community satisfaction with police interactions had improved, and the department's ranks had become noticeably more diverse. However, challenges remained. Some officers had chosen to leave the force rather than adapt to the new policies. Racial disparities in arrests and traffic stops, while improved, still persisted, and there were still community members who remained deeply skeptical of the police. Evelyn, reflecting on the year's efforts at conflict resolution, realized that they had made significant strides, but were still only at the beginning of a long journey. The conflicts that had been brought to light by the incident in the park were deeply rooted and would require ongoing effort and vigilance to fully resolve. As she prepared for a meeting with the Civilian Oversight Board to plan the next phase of reforms, Evelyn felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. The work of transforming the Millbrook Police Department and healing the rifts in the community was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt possible. The turning point for Millbrook came unexpectedly, about 18 months after the incident in the park. A high-profile case involving a white businessman accused of assaulting a young black employee thrust the city back into the national spotlight. As the case unfolded, it became clear that the reformed police department was handling the investigation differently than it might have in the past. Under Evelyn's guidance, the detectives involved were meticulous in their evidence gathering, transparent in their communications with both the victim's family and the accused's legal team, and steadfast in their commitment to following the facts wherever they led. The national media, which had previously portrayed Millbrook as yet another example of a city torn apart by racial tensions and police misconduct, now began to tell a different story. Articles and news segments highlighted the department's transformation, showcasing the Civilian Oversight Board, the new training programs, and the improved community relations. This shift in narrative marked a crucial turning point for Millbrook. It wasn't just about positive press. It represented a fundamental change in how the police department operated and how it was perceived by both its officers and the community it served. Mayor Thompson, recognizing the significance of this moment, called a meeting with Evelyn, Sarah Chen, who had become a key figure in community policing, and representatives from various community organizations. "We've been given a unique opportunity," Mayor Thompson began. "The spotlight is on us again, but this time it's for the right reasons. How do we leverage this to push our reforms even further?" The discussion that followed was intense and productive. They decided to take a bold new direction. Millbrook would position itself as a model for police reform, offering to share its experiences and best practices with other cities across the country. Evelyn proposed the creation of a police reform institute, housed within the department but operating independently, to conduct research, develop training programs, and consult with other cities on implementing similar reforms. This isn't just about changing our department anymore, Evelyn explained. It's about changing policing as a whole. The group unanimously agreed to the proposal. This new direction would not only help solidify the changes within Millbrook, but also extend their impact far beyond the city limits. As they left the meeting, there was a palpable sense of excitement and purpose. They had turned a corner, moving from reactive change to proactive leadership in the field of equitable policing. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, Millbrook was leading the way toward a new model of community-oriented, bias-free policing. As Millbrook embraced its new role as a leader in police reform, the key players in this journey found themselves reflecting on their personal growth and the transformations they had undergone. Evelyn Carter, sitting in her new office at the Police Reform Institute, marveled at how far she had come. From an undercover agent investigating police misconduct to a nationally recognized expert on community policing and bias reduction, her journey had been both challenging and rewarding. You know, she confided to Sarah Chen during a quiet moment, there were times I thought about walking away from all this, but now I feel like I'm exactly where I need to be, doing what I was meant to do. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of Evelyn's words. She too had grown significantly, from a conflicted young officer to a respected leader in community policing. We've all changed, Evelyn, but you've inspired that change in so many of us. Officer Bronson, now serving time for his assault on Evelyn, had undergone a profound transformation. Through mandated therapy and racial sensitivity training in prison, he had begun to confront his deep-seated biases and the harm they had caused. During a restorative justice session with Evelyn, facilitated by the prison, Bronson broke down. I'm sorry, he stammered, tears in his eyes. I never saw you as a person. I was so blinded by my own hate and fear. I know I can never undo what I did, but I want to do better. Evelyn, showing remarkable grace, reached out and took his hand. The first step is acknowledging the wrong, she said softly. The next is working to make it right. Mayor Thompson, reflecting on the city's journey, realized how much she too had grown. From a politician focused on maintaining the status quo, she had become a champion for progressive change. Millbrook has taught me that true leadership isn't about avoiding conflict, she mused during a press conference. It's about facing it head-on and guiding your community through it. The growth wasn't limited to individuals. The entire Millbrook community had undergone a collective transformation. Residents who had once viewed the police with suspicion now actively participated in community policing initiatives. Young people of color, inspired by Sarah's story and the changes in the department, were applying to join the force in record numbers. As Evelyn walked through the streets of Millbrook, she could feel the difference. There was a new sense of trust, a feeling of partnership between the police and the community that had been lacking for so long. Reflecting on this journey, Evelyn realized that the incident that had seemed like the lowest point in Millbrook's history had actually been the catalyst for profound positive change. It had forced everyone, herself, the officers, and the community at large, to confront uncomfortable truths and to grow beyond what they had thought possible. The transformation of Millbrook and its police force was far from complete. There would always be new challenges, new biases to confront, new trust to build. But as Evelyn looked toward the future, she felt a sense of hope and purpose that renewed her commitment to the work ahead. The journey had changed them all, reminding everyone involved that growth often comes from the most challenging experiences, and that with commitment and courage, even the deepest wounds can become the foundation for healing and progress. 2 years after the fateful day in Centennial Park, Millbrook hosted a national conference on equitable policing. As Evelyn Carter took the stage to deliver the keynote address, she looked out over a sea of faces. Police officers, community leaders, and activists from across the country, all eager to learn from Millbrook's experience. Our journey began with a moment of injustice, Evelyn began, her voice steady and sure. But it has led us to a place of transformation. We've learned that true justice isn't about maintaining the status quo. It's about having the courage to change, to confront our biases, and to reimagine what policing can be. As she spoke, Evelyn emphasized the key themes that had defined Millbrook's journey: the importance of accountability, the power of community engagement, and the ongoing work of confronting and overcoming bias. "This work is never done," she concluded. "Every day we must choose to see each other's humanity, to listen to each other's stories, and to work together for a justice system that truly serves all members of our community." The applause that followed was more than just approval. It was a collective commitment to carrying these lessons forward, to continue the difficult but essential work of reform. As the conference concluded, with departments from across the nation pledging to implement Millbrook-inspired reforms, there was a sense that something truly transformative had begun. What had started as one woman's ordeal in a park had blossomed into a movement with the potential to reshape policing across the country. The story of Millbrook served as a powerful reminder that change, while often born from pain and conflict, has the power to heal, unite, and inspire when embraced with courage and compassion.